The town didn't have a name. Not one that mattered anyway. Just a splintered piece of wood hanging from a single nail, creaking in the wind like a bone about to snap. The dust here never settled. It just moved from one broken dream to another, coating everything in a fine red grit. And down the town's only road, a road cracked and crooked like a dead man's smile, came a girl. Her name was Unya. She was 26, but the desert sun and a lifetime of trouble had carved lines around her mouth that made her look 40. Her eyes, though, held the skinned-alive look of a girl half her age. She hadn't cried in 6 years, not a single tear. She learned to carry pain the way a farmer learns to carry water, steady, careful, without spilling a drop. The townfolk watched her come. They always did. Beauty like hers, a wild, wounded thing, was an event in a place this forgotten. It was something to be stared at, whispered about, and ultimately broken. But nobody offered her a drink of water. Nobody asked if she was lost. They just pulled their children inside and drew their curtains as if her shadow alone could poison the well. Her dress was torn, the hem caked with mud. A crooked pin held the front together over her chest, and one side of her face was a rising storm of purple and blue, her lips split clean through. The blood had dried hours ago, but the taste of iron was still there, a taste like a promise of more to come. She'd come looking for work, a place to sweep, a barn to sleep in. That's what she told herself. But the men at the saloon, they heard a different story in her eyes. They laughed when she said no. They laughed harder when they dragged her out back. It wasn't about desire. It was about power, about finding something that still had a little light in it and proving they could put it out. She hadn't screamed. That, maybe, is what scared them. She just looked at them with eyes that burned like a fire in a flood, silent, unblinking. One of them spat on the ground and called her a witch, said she was cursed. Then they beat her until the world went sideways, and they left her by the town well like a sack of garbage. That was sunrise. Now the sun was bleeding out across the horizon, and she was still moving, one foot in front of the other. She reached the horse trough at the end of the street and collapsed beside it, her hands shaking as she scooped the murky water to her lips. It tasted like rust. It tasted like blood. She drank it anyway. Behind her, she heard the final sounds of the town shutting down for the night. Doors bolting, windows shuttering. This was a place where cruelty was the local sport, and looking the other way was the only rule. She found a small space behind the livery barn, a dark corner hidden by a stack of leaning crates. She pulled her knees to her chest, the sharp pain in her ribs making her gasp. Her breath hitched, her throat tightened, and for the first time in 6 long years, a tear escaped. It wasn't a sob. It was just a quiet, hot track through the dirt on her cheek. But once it started, it didn't stop. It was a flash flood in a dry riverbed. 6 years of silence, 6 years of holding it all in, pouring out of her in ragged, choking gasps. She cried until she couldn't breathe, and that's when she heard it, a sound that cut through her grief. Not the jeering laughter of the saloon men, not the heavy, drunken tread of boots on the boardwalk. It was the slow, steady footstep of a man who didn't hurry, because he never had to. The footsteps stopped. A long, tall shadow fell over her, blocking out the last of the dying light. She flinched, wiping her face on her sleeve, her hands scrambling in the dirt for a rock, a weapon, anything. Then she saw him, and he wasn't like the others, not at all. He didn't swagger, he didn't smirk. He just stood there, his frame outlined against the twilight sky. In one hand, he held a dented tin cup, steam rising from it like a ghost in the cold air. His hat was old and wide-brimmed, pulled low over his eyes. His duster was the color of the road, faded and worn. But it was his face that made her pause. There was a scar, a clean, pale line that ran from his ear right down to his chin. It wasn't an ugly scar. It was a piece of his history, worn right out in the open. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they were fixed on her. But there was no hunger in them, no pity, just a quiet, steady watchfulness. Like he was seeing everything all at once. He held out the cup. Unya didn't move. She was a coiled spring of fear and pain. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, but not in a mean way. It was just a voice that hadn't been used much. "You're safe now," he said. The words didn't make sense. They were a foreign language in this town. Safe? Here? After what had just happened? It was a lie. It had to be a trap. He didn't say it again. He just knelt, slow and careful, like he was approaching a wolf caught in a trap. He set the cup on the ground beside her, then stepped back, giving her space. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The metal was warm against her frozen fingers. She lifted it to her lips. It was broth. Not whiskey, not poison, just warm, salty broth. The simple kindness of it was so shocking it almost hurt more than the beating. The man took off his heavy duster. It was lined with wool, worn soft with age. He didn't try to put it on her, didn't try to touch her. He just laid it on the ground near her. An offering, not a claim. Then he turned and started to walk away. "Wait," she croaked. The single word tore at her throat. He stopped, turned back. His face was in shadow now, impossible to read. "Why?" she whispered. "Why help me?" He looked down at her, at the way she clutched the cup like a shield, the way she flinched from a simple coat. His gaze was heavy, like he was weighing every cruel thing that had ever been done in the world. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice so soft it was almost carried away by the wind. "Because someone should have." And with that, he turned again and walked on. He pointed a thumb toward the hills that rose up at the edge of town, where the sky was wide and dark and full of stars. "My place is up there," he said, "if you want shelter." He didn't add conditions. He didn't say, "just for the night." He just stated it as a fact. A place existed. She could go to it if she chose. He didn't look back again. Unia sat there, the warm cup in her hands, the heavy coat beside her. She could run. She could take her chances on the open road, head south, keep moving until she found a place where people weren't monsters. But her feet were bleeding. Her ribs felt like shattered glass. And her soul was tired of running. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet. She pulled the duster around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and rain. She picked up the empty cup and began to follow the tall, silent man into the darkness. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, sturdy box made of pine logs tucked away in a stand of trees. But there was a light on the porch, a single lantern burning with a warm, golden glow. It looked like a welcome. It looked like a memory of a home she'd never had. The man opened the door and stood aside, letting her pass. He still didn't speak. He didn't need to. Something in the way he stood, in the quiet respect he gave her, made the fear in her belly loosen its grip, just a little. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her, the sound as soft as a breath. The room smelled of cedar and something simmering over the fire. Onions and herbs and rich, savory meat. The warmth from the hearth wrapped around her like a blanket. A rocking chair by the fire swayed gently, as if someone had just gotten up. The man moved past her without a word, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. He added another log to the fire, the sparks dancing up the chimney like fireflies. Unia stayed by the door, her back pressed against the wood. Her body remembered rooms like this, remembered how quickly warmth could turn into a cage. The man seemed to notice her fear, though he never looked directly at her. "You can leave it open," he said, his voice quiet. "If you need." She glanced back. The door wasn't latched. The night air, cool and smelling of pine, slipped in through the crack. "A door's not meant to hold someone in," he added, stirring the pot over the fire. Unia hesitated. Then slowly she reached behind her and pushed the door shut. But she didn't throw the bolt. It was a small thing, but it felt like a choice. Her choice. He ladled a thick stew into a bowl and set it on the small wooden table. Then he stepped away, giving her the entire room. He didn't watch her. He didn't wait for her to eat. He just sat in the rocker and stared into the fire. Hunger, sharp and vicious, tore through her. She approached the table like a wild animal, ready to bolt at the first sudden move. She took the spoon and tasted the stew. It was the best thing she had ever eaten. Rich and hot and real. It tasted of salt and thyme and a deep, slow-cooked tenderness that made her eyes well up again. She didn't thank him. Words felt cheap and useless. He didn't seem to expect them. When she finished, he took her bowl without a word, refilled it, and set it back down. They didn't speak for hours. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a comfortable one, a silence that didn't demand to be filled. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, he finally spoke. "Name's Ransom," he said to the flames. Just that. No story. No questions. She waited until he was asleep, his breathing deep and even in the rocking chair, before she whispered her own name into the quiet of the cabin. Yunya. The name hung in the air for a moment. She thought he didn't hear, but then, just for a second, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch into a small, sleepy smile. He had laid a thick blanket and a pillow made of a folded sack by the hearth for her. She curled up on it, pulling the wool tight around her. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't cold. But as she drifted off to sleep, she noticed something odd. The floorboards beneath her blanket were warm, not just from the fire, but consistently, deeply warm. It was almost as if the fire hadn't been allowed to die down all night, as if someone had been awake, watching over it, and over her. Morning light filtered through the single window, dusty and pale. A rooster crowed somewhere, far away. The smell of coffee, sharp and strong, filled the small cabin. Yunya opened her eyes, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. She expected to be alone. She expected him to be gone, the kindness of the night before just a strange dream. But when she looked out the window, he was there. He was splitting wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady hypnotic rhythm. His sleeves were rolled up, showing lean, hard muscle in his forearms. This wasn't the body of a man who worked for show. This was the body of a man who worked to survive. Each swing was perfect, efficient, powerful. There was no wasted motion. She watched him for a long time before she sat up. The worst of the swelling on her face had gone down, but a deep, throbbing ache remained. On a small table by the wall, she found a basin of clean water, a folded cloth, and a small, half-used bar of lye soap. It was another small, unspoken kindness. She scrubbed her face and hands, the sting of the soap a welcome distraction from the deeper pain. When she stepped outside onto the porch, the cold morning air made her shiver. She was still barefoot. Ransom stopped his work. He looked at her, his stormy eyes taking in her clean face, her tangled hair. He didn't speak. He just walked over to a nearby stump where he'd been working, picked something up, and handed it to her. It was an apple, peeled and cored. She took it, careful not to let their fingers touch. She sat on the edge of the porch and ate it slowly, the sweet, crisp fruit a shocking contrast to the iron taste that had filled her mouth for the past day. He broke the silence. "Where were you heading?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. She had to think about it. The question felt like it was from another life. "Anywhere," she said finally, her voice raspy. "Anywhere folks ain't cruel." He nodded as if that was the most reasonable destination in the world. He leaned his axe against the stump and looked out at the hills, now turning blue and gold in the rising sun. "You'll find fewer of those places than you hope," he murmured. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. She looked at him sideways. "You think this town's different?" "No," he said simply, "just quieter." And that's when she realized he hadn't just been splitting wood. He'd been watching the tree line, his gaze constantly sweeping back and forth, from the edge of the woods to the path leading back down to the town. He wasn't just working, he was on guard. But what was he guarding against? He seemed to sense her question. He walked back into the cabin and came out with a pair of worn leather boots. They were old, but the leather was soft and well-oiled. "These were my father's," he said, setting them down on the porch in front of her. "They'll be too big, but they're better than nothing." She stared at the boots. Another kindness. Another question. Why was this man, this stranger, doing all this for her? She pulled them on. They were ridiculously large, but they were warm, and the thick soles felt like armor between her bruised feet and the cold, hard ground. She stood up, feeling taller, stronger. She didn't say thank you. She didn't know how. Instead, she asked a question of her own. "Who are you, Ransom?" He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Something more than just quiet watchfulness. It was a deep, old sadness. A shadow. "I'm just a man trying to be left alone," he said. But Yunya knew, deep in her gut, that it was a lie. He wasn't just a man, and whatever he was running from, it hadn't left him alone at all. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. It wasn't a routine. It was more like two wounded animals learning to share the same space, circling each other slowly, cautiously. Yunya helped where she could. She gathered kindling, hauled water from the creek, learned to cook on the open hearth. The work was hard, but it was honest. It made her feel solid, real. The bruises on her body faded, and the bruises on her soul began to feel a little less raw. Ransom never told her what to do. He never watched over her shoulder. He just left the tools out where she could find them, and when she did a task, he would give a single, almost imperceptible nod of approval. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken things, with the steady chop of his axe, the soft scrape of her broom on the floorboards, the crackle of the fire at night. One evening, while he was outside tending to the single bony horse he kept in a small lean-to, Yunya found herself drawn to an old saddle he kept by the hearth. It wasn't on display like a trophy. It was just there, close, as if for comfort. The leather was worn smooth and dark with age and use. She ran her hand over the pommel, tracing the intricate tooling. And that's when she saw it. Burned into the leather, almost hidden in the decorative pattern, was a small, strange brand. It was a coiled snake eating its own tail, an Ouroboros. It was a symbol she had never seen before, but it sent a shiver down her spine. It felt ancient and dangerous. "It was my father's," Ransom said from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, watching her. She hadn't even heard him come in. She pulled her hand back, as if burned. "He used to say a saddle tells you everything you need to know about a man," Ransom continued, his voice soft. She looked from the strange brand to his face. "And what does this one say about you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just pushed off the doorframe and walked over to the fire, staring down into the flames. "That I'm still here, I suppose." It wasn't an answer. It was a deflection. Another wall. That night, the past came for her. She woke up with a strangled gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was back in the alley behind the saloon. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies filled her nose. The leering faces of the men surrounded her, their laughter echoing in her ears. One of them reached for her, his hand like a claw. She sat bolt upright, clawing at the blanket, her breath coming in ragged, terrified sobs. A shadow moved by the fire. He was there. Instantly. Crouching beside her, his body a solid, dark shape in the firelight. "I'm not touching you," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble. "You were dreaming. You're safe." "Safe," she choked out, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her splintering pieces together. "You say that so easy." "I don't say much easy," he replied. And then she saw it. In the flickering light from the dying fire, she saw the glint of steel. He wasn't just crouching beside her. His hand was resting on the handle of a long, wicked-looking knife tucked into his belt, a knife she had never seen before. It wasn't the knife of a farmer or a woodcutter. It was the knife of a killer. Her blood ran cold. The image from her dream, the claw-like hand reaching for her, morphed into the image of Ransom's hand, resting on that deadly blade. Who was this man? The kind savior who offered her broth and a warm place to sleep? Or was he something else entirely? Something far more dangerous than the thugs in the saloon? The silence in the cabin was suddenly thick with a new kind of tension, a new kind of fear, and Yunya realized that she might have escaped one cage only to walk willingly into another. They sat there for a long time, the only sound the pop and hiss of the embers in the hearth. The knife in his belt seemed to catch the light, a silent, gleaming threat. Yunya finally found her voice. "I used to think," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the fire, "that safety meant nobody seeing you, being invisible." Ransom didn't move. He just listened. "But I think being invisible just lets people hurt you without consequence," she continued. "They don't have to look you in the eye." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes being seen is harder," he said, his voice still low. "But it's better." She finally dared to look at him, really look at him, At the hard lines of his face, the old scar, the coiled readiness in his body, even at rest, at the killer's knife tucked into his belt. "You've been through it too," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't flinch. He just gave a single, sharp nod. "Some." "Then why aren't you mean?" she asked, the question raw and real. "Like them. Like all the others." He seemed to consider this for a moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his answer was different this time. It wasn't a simple platitude. It was darker, heavier. "Because I know what it costs," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "And I've already paid too much." Before she could ask what he meant, before she could process the chilling finality in his tone, there was a sound from outside, a loud, deliberate knock on the cabin door. Yunya froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Ransom was on his feet in an instant, moving with a silent, fluid grace that was terrifying. He put a finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet, and then he moved to the door. He didn't open it. He just stood beside it, listening. "Ransom!" a voice called from outside. It was a greasy, familiar voice, a voice that dripped with arrogance and casual cruelty. "I know you're in there, and I know you got something that belongs to the town." Yunya's stomach turned to ice. It was Lo, one of the men from the saloon, one of the ones who had held her down. Ransom didn't answer. He just stood there, perfectly still, his hand resting once again on the handle of his knife. "We saw the smoke from your chimney, Ransom," Lo shouted, his voice closer now, right outside the door. "Heard you took in some stray. Well, the boys are thirsty, and we figure she owes us a drink. Ain't no hard feelings. Just send her on out." Yunya scrambled back from the door, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. They had found her. Her brief moment of peace, of safety, was over. Ransom turned his head slowly and looked at her. His eyes were no longer calm and stormy. They were like chips of ice, cold, hard, and utterly ruthless. He mouthed a single word to her. "Stay." Then he drew the knife from his belt. The blade was long and dark, and it made no sound as it slid free. He took a deep breath, and then, with a speed that defied belief, he kicked the door open. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp. Lo was standing on the porch, a smug, ugly grin on his face. Behind him, two other men from the saloon were lurking in the shadows. Lo's grin vanished when he saw Ransom. It vanished even faster when he saw the knife. "Now hold on, Ransom," Lo stammered, taking a step back. "We don't want no trouble." "You're already in it," Ransom said, his voice a low, deadly growl that Yunya had never heard before. It was the voice of a predator. What happened next was a blur of motion. Lo reached for a pistol tucked in his own belt, but he never had a chance. Ransom lunged forward, not like a man, but like a striking snake. There was a flash of steel, a choked gasp from Lo, and the pistol clattered to the wooden porch. Ransom hadn't stabbed him. He had done something else. With a single, precise movement, he had sliced the leather gun belt clean in two. In the same motion, his other hand shot out and grabbed Lo by the throat, slamming him back against the porch post. "Listen to me very carefully," Ransom hissed, his face inches from Lo's. The other two men stood frozen in the darkness, too terrified to move. "Her name is Yunya, and she is under my protection. You will go back to town. You will tell your friends. You will tell anyone who asks that this place and everything in it is off limits." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "And you will tell Silas that his hound has been put back on its leash. Understand?" Lo, his face pale and sweating, could only manage a series of frantic, terrified nods. "Good," Ransom said. He let go of Lo's throat, and the man stumbled back, gasping for air. "Now get off my land, and if I ever see your face again, I will carve it off and feed it to the crows." The three men scrambled away into the darkness, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Ransom stood on the porch for a long moment, watching them go. The deadly stillness was still on him. He turned slowly and came back inside, shutting the door behind him. He slid the bolt home with a loud final click. He turned to face Yunya. His chest was rising and falling rapidly. The mask of the quiet, gentle man was gone completely. In his place stood a stranger, a man capable of terrifying violence, a man who moved with the lethal grace of a trained killer. He looked at the fear in her eyes, and something in his own face seemed to crumple. The hardness faded, replaced by that same deep, old sadness. Yunia, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm sorry you had to see that. But it wasn't the violence that had shaken her to her core. It wasn't the knife or the threat. It was the name he had spoken, a name that meant nothing to her, but had clearly struck terror into the heart of a man like Lowe. Silas. Who was Silas? And what, in God's name, was his connection to the quiet man standing in front of her? The cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. The bolted door, which should have felt like security, now felt like a cage. Unia stared at Ransom, seeing not just the man who had shown her kindness, but the predator he had revealed himself to be. "Who is Silas?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ransom ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. He walked over to the hearth and slid the long knife back into its sheath. "He's the man who owns this valley," he said without turning around. "He owns the saloon. He owns the sheriff. He owns the men who hurt you." Unia's blood went cold. This wasn't just a cruel town. It was a kingdom, and Silas was its king. She had stumbled into the lion's den. "And you," she pressed, "what are you to him?" Ransom finally turned to face her. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, making the scar on his jaw stand out like a brand. "I used to be his right hand," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "His enforcer, his hound, like Lowe said." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Every act of kindness, every quiet moment, was now cast in a new, sinister light. Was her rescue just a part of some game between these two men? Was she a pawn? "The men in the alley," she whispered, the horror dawning on her. "Did you know them?" "I knew their kind," he answered, his eyes filled with a self-loathing so deep it was bottomless. "I taught them their kind of cruelty. I was worse than any of them." Unia felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The man who had saved her from monsters was a monster himself. Or he had been. Which was it? She didn't know what to believe. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you leave him?" Ransom's gaze drifted to the scar on his face. He touched it gently, as if the memory still burned. "Silas has a rule," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Everything in his valley belongs to him. People, property, loyalty. One day I broke that rule. I helped someone escape. A girl. A lot like you. Silas didn't take kindly to his property being stolen." He let his hand drop. "He gave me this scar as a reminder of who I belong to. I gave him 2 dead men and a burned-down barn as my resignation. I've been hiding up here ever since, trying to forget the man I was." The silence that followed was absolute. Unia tried to piece it all together. Ransom wasn't just hiding from the world. He was hiding from a specific man, a very powerful, very dangerous man. And by taking her in, he had just painted a target on both of their backs. "He'll come for you," she said, "now that he knows you're breaking his rules again." "Let him come," Ransom said, and the deadly coldness was back in his voice. "This time, I'm not running." That night, Unia didn't sleep by the fire. She sat in the chair farthest from the door, the heavy duster wrapped around her, watching him. He didn't sleep either. He sat in the rocker, cleaning the long, dark knife with an oiled cloth, his movements slow and methodical. He was preparing for war, and she was trapped in the middle of it. The next morning, the world outside the cabin seemed different. The trees seemed to press in closer. The silence of the woods was no longer peaceful. It was watchful, menacing. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird made her jump. Ransom was different too. The quiet gentleness was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He checked the perimeter of the cabin, his eyes scanning every shadow. He brought in more firewood, more water, as if preparing for a siege. He tried to talk to her, to reassure her, but his words felt hollow. The image of him on the porch, a knife in his hand, and murder in his eyes was burned into her memory. She had to get away. She waited until he was at the back of the cabin, splitting the last of the logs. His back was turned. The rhythmic thud of the axe was the only sound. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was her chance. She slipped out the front door, her oversized boots making no sound on the packed earth. She didn't run. She walked, fast and quiet, melting into the trees, heading away from the cabin, away from the path that led to town. She would take her chances in the wilderness. It had to be better than waiting for a war to start. She didn't look back. She just kept moving, pushing through the underbrush, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She thought she had made it. She thought she was free. And then she stumbled. Her foot caught on a root, and she pitched forward, her hands flying out to break her fall. She landed hard, the air knocked out of her lungs. When she looked down to see what she had tripped on, she screamed. It wasn't a root, it was a wire. A thin, dark tripwire almost invisible against the forest floor, and it was connected to a small, dark bundle of sticks and rags, tied together with twine. From the center of the bundle, a wisp of smoke was curling upwards. It was a crude bomb, a trap, and she had just triggered it. Panic seized her, a cold, absolute terror that rooted her to the spot. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was mesmerized by the thin curl of smoke, by the fizzing sound that was growing louder every second. Then a force like a thunderclap slammed into her from the side, throwing her clear of the trap. She hit the ground hard, rolling over and over through the dirt and leaves. The world exploded in a deafening roar of fire and splintered wood. The blast wave washed over her, hot and violent, pressing her into the earth. Shrapnel, dirt, and pieces of the forest rained down around her. The sound echoed through the valley, a savage announcement that the quiet war had just begun. Yunya lay on the ground, stunned, her ears ringing. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw a figure moving towards her. It was Ransom. He knelt beside her, his face grim, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he yelled over the ringing in her ears. She shook her head, unable to speak. She was covered in dirt, but she was alive. He had saved her. Again. He must have seen her leave, must have followed her. He helped her to her feet, his grip on her arm firm and steady. "They're testing the fences," he said, his eyes scanning the smoldering crater where the trap had been, seeing if the wolf is still in his den. He looked at her then, his gaze intense. "You can't run, Yunya. There's nowhere to go. Silas owns every road out of this valley. The only way out is through him." The hope that had fueled her escape attempt shriveled and died. He was right. She was trapped. Her fate was now tied to this strange, violent man and the ghosts of his past. They walked back to the cabin in silence. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. The woods no longer felt like a sanctuary. They felt like a hunting ground. When they got back, Ransom didn't waste any time. He began to barricade the cabin. He jammed a thick wooden bar across the door. He nailed heavy shutters over the single window. The small, welcoming cabin was quickly transformed into a fortress, a tomb. Yunya watched him, a numb dread spreading through her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait," he said, his voice grim. He picked up a rifle that had been leaning in the corner, a weapon she hadn't noticed before. He checked the action, his movements practiced and sure. "They know I'm here, and they know I have something to protect. They'll be back." The waiting was the worst part. Every hour that dragged by was a new kind of torture. The silence was absolute. The darkness in the shuttered cabin was thick and suffocating. Yunya found herself watching Ransom. He sat in his rocking chair, the rifle across his lap, perfectly still. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was patient. A predator waiting for the hunt to come to him. She saw him in a new light now. The violence she had witnessed wasn't a flaw. It was a skill, a tool he had learned to use to survive in a world that had tried to break him. The gentleness he had shown her, the quiet kindness, wasn't a mask. It was who he was trying to become. It was the man he was fighting to be. He had built this quiet life, this small pocket of peace, as a wall against the darkness of his past. And she had, by stumbling into his life, brought that darkness crashing down upon him. A wave of guilt washed over her. "This is my fault," she whispered into the dark. "If I hadn't come here." "No," he cut her off, his voice firm. This day was coming sooner or later. Silas never lets go of anything he thinks is his. You just, you just reminded me of what's worth fighting for. His words hung in the air, a quiet confession. He wasn't just fighting for his own life. He was fighting for her. The first attack came just after dusk. It wasn't a full-on assault. It was a test. A single gunshot shattered the silence of the night, followed by the splintering of wood as the bullet slammed into the cabin door. Ransom was moving before the echo of the shot had faded. He didn't go to the door. He went to a loose floorboard near the hearth, one she had never noticed before. He pried it up, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy, leather-wrapped bundle. He unrolled it on the floor. Inside were more guns. A matched pair of Colt revolvers, their silver handles gleaming in the firelight. A repeating rifle, its wood stock dark and oiled, and boxes upon boxes of ammunition. This wasn't just a man hiding from his past. This was a man who had been preparing for its return. He handed one of the revolvers to Yunya. It was heavy, cold, and terrifying. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "Point it at whatever you don't want to be alive anymore, and pull the trigger," he said, his voice deadly serious. "Don't stop pulling until it's empty." Another shot rang out, this one hitting the shuttered window, making the wood groan in protest. Ransom moved to a small chink in the logs near the door, a peephole she had never seen. He peered out into the darkness. "Just 3 of them," he murmured. "They're getting sloppy." He moved to the opposite wall, to a similar peephole. He raised his rifle, the long barrel resting in the small opening. He was calm, focused. His breathing was slow and even. Yunya crouched by the hearth, the heavy revolver in her trembling hands. She could hear them outside now, their voices low and taunting. They were circling the cabin, testing its defenses. Then there was a new sound, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the ground, the clink of glass, the slosh of liquid. Ransom swore under his breath. "They're going to try and burn us out." Fear, sharp and acidic, flooded Yunya's throat. They were going to be burned alive, trapped in this wooden box. She looked at Ransom. He was still at the peephole, his rifle steady. He was waiting. For what? Then a flicker of light from outside. A torch. It illuminated the face of one of the men. It was one of Lowe's cronies from the other night. He was holding a bottle filled with oil, a rag stuffed in the top. The man lit the rag. He drew his arm back, ready to throw the firebomb at the cabin. And in that instant, the world exploded in the deafening crack of Ransom's rifle. The shot was so loud inside the small cabin that it felt like a physical blow. Yunya flinched, her eyes squeezed shut. When she opened them, she saw Ransom already working the lever on his rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new one. His movements were a blur of efficiency. Through the peephole, she could see the chaos outside. The man with the firebomb had crumpled to the ground, the torch falling from his hand and sputtering out in the damp earth. The other 2 men were shouting, firing blindly into the darkness. "One!" Ransom said, his voice as cold and hard as iron. He moved to the other side of the cabin, to the second peephole. He didn't rush. He was a creature of absolute, terrifying patience. He waited. The shooting from outside stopped. There was a moment of tense silence. Then one of the men broke from cover, trying to make a run for the safety of the trees. He was a dark shape against the moonlit ground. The rifle cracked again. The running man pitched forward and didn't get up. "2," Ransom said. The silence that followed was different. It was a dead silence. A heavy, final silence. The third man was still out there, hiding in the shadows. But he was alone now. And he knew he was hunting something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Yunya held her breath, the revolver clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Then a voice from the darkness. "Ransom, I give up! Don't shoot!" Ransom didn't answer. He just stayed at the peephole, his rifle steady. "It was Silas!" the man yelled, his voice shaking with terror. "He sent us! He said to bring the girl back, or burn you out. We didn't have a choice." Still, Ransom was silent. "I'm leaving!" the man screamed. "I'm going! You won't see me again!" There was the sound of someone scrambling through the underbrush, running for their life. The sound faded into the distance, leaving only the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind in the pines. Ransom stayed at his post for a long time after, making sure it wasn't a trick. Finally, he lowered the rifle and turned to face Yunya. His face was a mask, unreadable. He looked at the two dead men he had just made, and he didn't even blink. He had killed them with the same detached efficiency he used to split firewood. This was the man he used to be, the Hound, and he had just been unleashed. He walked over to her and gently took the revolver from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers and his touch was warm. It was a strange contrast to the coldness in his eyes. "It's over," he said, "for tonight." But they both knew it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Silas had sent his hounds. Now that they had failed, the master himself would come. Yunya looked at this man, this killer who had twice saved her life. She was no longer afraid of him. She was afraid for him. She saw the cost of his past in the haunted look in his eyes, in the grim set of his jaw. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the men outside, and one against the man he used to be. She reached out and touched the scar on his jaw, her fingers tracing the pale, thin line. "You did this for me," she whispered. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch. "I did this for us," he corrected her, his voice rough. In that moment, something shifted between them. The fear, the suspicion, the walls they had both built. They all seemed to crumble away, leaving something new and fragile in their place. A connection forged in fire and blood. She didn't know if it was trust or gratitude or something deeper, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to run, not anymore. She was going to stay. She was going to fight. Because Ransom's home had become her home, and his war had become her war. The next few days were a blur of grim preparation. Ransom was a man transformed. He moved with a purpose that was both methodical and relentless. He taught Yunya how to load and fire the revolver, his hands guiding hers with a gentle patience that belied the deadly purpose of the lesson. He showed her how to track, how to read the signs of the forest, how to move without making a sound. He was teaching her how to survive. He also talked. For the first time, he opened up about his past. He told her stories about Silas Cain, a man who ruled his empire through fear and a twisted sense of ownership. A man who saw people not as human beings, but as possessions. He told her about the things he had done in Silas's name, the violence he had committed. He didn't make excuses. He laid his sins bare, his voice heavy with the weight of them. And Yunya listened. She saw the pain and regret that drove him, the deep desire to atone for the man he had been. Her fear of him was replaced by a fierce, protective empathy. One afternoon, as they were reinforcing the small lean-to where the horse was kept, she found him sketching in a small leather-bound book. She had seen him do it before, but had never asked what he was drawing. She looked over his shoulder. He wasn't sketching horses or trees. He was sketching her. There were dozens of drawings of her. Yunya sweeping the floor, Yunya carrying water from the creek, Yunya staring into the fire. He had captured her in moments of quiet strength, his pencil lines both strong and delicate. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't look up from his drawing. "Because I need to remember," he said quietly, "what strength looks like, what goodness looks like." He turned a page. On it was a single perfect drawing of a violet, the kind that grew by the creek. "You're like these," he said. "The first thing that dares to grow after a long, hard winter. A sign that things can be new again." Tears welled in Yunya's eyes. No one had ever seen her like that. They had seen a victim, a stray, a thing to be used or broken. But Ransom, he saw a survivor. He saw hope. That night, the attack they had been waiting for came. It wasn't a few thugs this time. It was an army. Under the light of a full moon, they saw them coming. A dozen men on horseback, riding out of the trees, their forms dark and menacing, and at their head, a man on a massive black stallion. Even from a distance, he radiated an aura of absolute power and cruelty. Silas Cain had come. "Get inside," Ransom said, his voice low and urgent. He pushed Yunya towards the cabin door. "Bar it and don't open it. For anything." "What are you going to do?" she cried, her heart seizing with fear. I'm going to end this, he said. He gave her one last, intense look, his stormy eyes full of 1,000 unspoken words. Then he turned, grabbed his rifle, and walked out to meet them. He didn't take cover. He just stood in the middle of the clearing in front of his cabin, a lone figure against a dozen armed men. It was suicide. Unia watched from the peephole, her knuckles white as she gripped the revolver. Silas and his men reined in their horses a few dozen yards from Ransom. Silas dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a big man, dressed in black, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. "Ransom," Silas called out, his voice a deep, resonant boom that carried across the clearing. "It's been a long time. I see you found yourself another stray." "She's not yours, Silas," Ransom said, his voice calm and steady, but loud enough to carry. Silas laughed, a cold, ugly sound. "Everything in this valley is mine, boy. You know that. I let you live up here in your little hovel out of a sense of nostalgia. But you've broken the rules again. You stole from me. First that other little bird, and now this one. And you killed my men. That has a price." "I'm done paying your prices," Ransom said. "Oh, I think you're not," Silas sneered. He turned to his men. "Kill him, and bring me the girl. Unharmed. I want to teach her a lesson in property rights." The men raised their rifles. This was it. It was over. And then something happened that no one expected. A voice cried out from the trees. "You'll have to go through us first, Silas." From the edge of the woods, people started to emerge. First, the old widow from up the hill, holding an ancient-looking shotgun. Then the blacksmith from town, armed with a heavy hammer. Then another farmer, and another. One by one, the quiet, beaten-down people of the valley, the ones who had always looked the other way, stepped out of the shadows. They were armed with hunting rifles, pitchforks, axes. They were terrified, but they were there. They formed a ragged, determined line behind Ransom. Silas stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What is this? You dare to stand against me? I own you." "Not anymore," the blacksmith said, his voice ringing with newfound courage. "Ransom showed us what it means to stand up. We're done being your property." For the first time, Unia saw a flicker of uncertainty in Silas Kane's eyes. He had ruled through fear, by keeping everyone isolated and afraid. He never imagined they would unite. Silas looked at Ransom, his eyes burning with a murderous hatred. "You did this," he hissed. "You poisoned them against me." "I just reminded them they were free," Ransom replied. "Then you'll all die free," Silas roared. He raised his own pistol, aiming it directly at Ransom's heart, but he was too late. The single shot that rang out didn't come from Silas's men. It didn't come from Ransom. It came from the cabin door. Unia stood there, the heavy revolver held steady in both hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Silas Kane staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A dark red stain was spreading across the front of his black coat. He looked down at his chest, then back at Unia. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then he collapsed into the dust. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then Silas's men, their leader dead, their will broken, turned their horses and fled into the night. It was over. The townspeople let out a ragged cheer. Ransom turned and stared at Unia, his face a mixture of shock, pride, and overwhelming relief. She lowered the gun, her hands shaking. He ran to her, sweeping her up in his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "I told you to stay inside," he whispered into her hair. "I'm done with hiding," she whispered back, burying her face in his shoulder. The sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the valley. It was a new day. For the first time, it was their day. Their valley. Their future. A future they had earned with blood and courage, and a love that had bloomed in the darkest of places, like a violet in the snow. A few months later, on the porch of the small cabin, they were married. The entire town was there. The widow brought a lace veil, the blacksmith brought a hammered silver ring, and everyone brought food and music and laughter. Unia wore a simple dress of soft blue cotton. She didn't have a mirror, but when she saw the look in Ransom's eyes, she knew she was beautiful. He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. I don't have much to give you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Just a quiet life, a safe place, all of my days. That's everything, she said, her voice full of tears and joy. That's all I ever wanted. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, they danced on the porch, surrounded by their friends, by their family. The quiet man and the wounded girl, who had found in each other not just a refuge but a home. They had faced the darkness together and come out the other side, into the light. And they knew with a certainty that was as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet, that whatever came next, they would face it together. So let me ask you, as our story comes to a close, what do you think is the true meaning of strength? Is it the power to fight, like Ransom? Or is it the courage to heal, like Yunya? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story of survival and love found in unexpected places resonated with you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the all-powerful YouTube algorithm that stories about hope and courage are worth sharing. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because there are so many more stories waiting to be told around this campfire. Thank you for spending your time with me today. And remember, no matter how dark the night gets, there is always a dawn waiting to break.